I watched Sheriff Karen unplug the last air conditioning unit while 93-year-old Mrs. Rodriguez collapsed from heat exhaustion on the floor behind her. The temperature outside was 108 degrees. Inside our emergency cooling center, it was climbing fast. Karen turned to me with that cold smile and said the words that still make my blood boil. Maybe now these people will learn not to waste taxpayer money on charity cases. 3 minutes later, I was on the phone ordering the biggest climate control trailer in the county. What happened next changed everything. The summer of 2023 was the hottest on record in our small Texas town. I had been volunteering at the community cooling center for 3 years, ever since my retirement from the school district. When the temperatures hit triple digits and stayed there for weeks, our little center became a lifeline for the most vulnerable people in our community. Every morning at 7, I unlocked the doors to the old community center on Maple Street. The building was not much to look at from the outside, but inside it was cool, clean, and safe. Elderly residents who could not afford to run their air conditioning all day would arrive with their medications and folding chairs. Homeless veterans like Jake Martinez would sleep on the tile floors, finally getting relief from the brutal heat. Young mothers with bobbies would sit in the plastic chairs, grateful for a place where their children could play without suffering. Mrs. Rodriguez was my regular. She was 93 years old and lived alone in a trailer with broken air conditioning. Every day, she would walk the 6 blocks to our center, carrying her little purse and her church fan. She would sit in the same chair by the window, watching the birds in the parking lot and chatting with the other seniors. "Mija," she would say to me, "you are an angel for keeping this place running." I was not an angel. I was just a retired teacher who believed that nobody should have to choose between paying their electric bill and staying alive in dangerous heat. The cooling center had been my idea originally. I had petitioned the city council, organized the volunteers, and worked with local churches to keep it funded and operational. Sheriff Karen Blackwood had always been supportive of our work, at least on the surface. She would stop by occasionally, usually when local news cameras were around. She would shake hands with the elderly folks and talk about community partnerships. Her deputies would sometimes bring bottled water or help with small maintenance issues. "This is exactly the kind of community service we need more of," she had told the local paper just last month. "The sheriff's department is proud to support programs that help our most vulnerable citizens." I believed her. I actually trusted her. That trust was about to be shattered in the most cruel way possible. The morning of July 15th, the temperature was already 95 degrees when I arrived at the center. The Weather Service had issued an excessive heat warning. The forecast showed at least a week of temperatures above 105 degrees. I knew we would be busy. By 10 o'clock, we had 37 people seeking relief in our air-conditioned space. Mrs. Rodriguez was in her usual spot. Jake was stretched out on the cool tile floor, reading a paperback novel. 3 young mothers sat with their toddlers, letting the children play with donated toys while they recharged their phones. The air conditioning was working perfectly. The temperature inside was a comfortable 72 degrees. Everyone was safe, hydrated, and protected from the killer heat outside. I had no idea that Sheriff Karen was about to turn our sanctuary into a death trap. I was refilling the water cooler when I heard the first air conditioning unit shut down. The sudden silence made me look up from my task. These were commercial units, not the kind that cycled on and off. They ran continuously during heat waves like this one. The second unit went quiet 30 seconds later, then the third. "Excuse me," called out Mrs. Rodriguez from her chair. Is something wrong with the air conditioning? I dropped the water jug and rushed toward the electrical panel. The temperature was already starting to climb. With nearly 40 people in the building and no air circulation, it would get dangerous fast. That was when I saw Sheriff Karen standing next to the main electrical panel, her hand on the final air conditioning unit's power cord. She was dressed in her full uniform, complete with gun, belt, and badge. Her expression was cold and determined. "Sheriff Blackwood," I said, my voice shaking with confusion, "what are you doing?" She pulled the plug on the last unit and turned to face me. The building was now completely without air conditioning. Outside, the temperature was climbing toward 108 degrees. "I am saving the taxpayers of this county from waste and abuse," she said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "This building is consuming over $200 of electricity per day, money that could be spent on real law enforcement needs." I stared at her in shock. "Sheriff, there are elderly people in here. Bobbies, the heat index is dangerous. People could die." She shrugged. "Maybe that will teach them not to expect handouts. There are plenty of jobs available for people who want to work instead of sitting around in free air conditioning all day." Mrs. Rodriguez was fanning herself with her church bulletin, but I could see the sweat already beading on her forehead. Jake sat up from the floor, his face showing concern. The mothers were gathering their children, sensing trouble. "You cannot just turn off the air conditioning," I protested. "This is an emergency cooling center. We have permission from the city council." "The city council does not pay the electric bill," Karen replied, folding her arms across her chest. "The county does, and as sheriff, I have the authority to investigate waste and abuse of public resources." I felt my heart racing. This is not waste. These people need this service. Look around you. Do you see anyone here who is not genuinely in need? Karen glanced around the room with disgust. "I see a bunch of people who have learned to depend on government handouts instead of taking care of themselves. This bleeding heart nonsense is exactly what is wrong with this country." The temperature in the building was rising fast. I could feel the heat beginning to build. Several of the elderly residents were starting to look uncomfortable. One of the mothers was trying to fan her baby with a magazine. "Please," I begged, "at least let me plug the units back in until people can make other arrangements." "Absolutely not," Karen snapped. "Those units stay unplugged. If you attempt to restore power without proper authorization, I will have you arrested for theft of public utilities." She walked toward the door, her boots clicking on the tile floor. At the exit, she turned back one final time. "Maybe next time. You people will think twice before expecting the county to pay for your comfort." The door slammed behind her, leaving us in the rapidly heating building. I stood there for a moment, unable to process what had just happened. Then Mrs. Rodriguez spoke up from her chair. "Mija, what are we going to do?" I looked around at the faces of the people who had trusted me to keep them safe. Elderly residents who could not survive in the heat. Homeless veterans with nowhere else to go. Young mothers with bobbies who would suffer in the dangerous temperatures. That was when I realized that Sheriff Karen had just declared war on the most vulnerable people in our community. And I was the only one standing between them and potential death. Within 20 minutes, the temperature inside the building had climbed to 85 degrees. The elderly residents were already showing signs of distress. Mrs. Rodriguez was breathing heavily, her face flushed red. Jake was helping her sip water from a paper cup, but I could see the concern in his eyes. I tried to stay calm, but my mind was racing. I had to get these people to safety, but I had nowhere to take them. The library was too small. The churches were not equipped for this many people. And most importantly, I could not just abandon the cooling center and let Sheriff Karen win. "Everyone, please listen to me," I announced to the room. "I am going to solve this problem. I need you to stay hydrated and stay as cool as possible. If anyone feels dizzy or nauseous, please let me know immediately." I grabbed my phone and started making calls. First, I called the city council president but got his voicemail. Then I tried the mayor's office but was told he was out of town. I called the county commissioner, but his secretary said he was in meetings all day. Meanwhile, the situation was getting worse. The building was now over 90 degrees. Two of the elderly residents were showing signs of heat exhaustion. One of the mothers had taken her baby outside, but the temperature out there was even more dangerous. I decided to try plugging the units back in myself. I had to risk it. But as soon as I touched the first electrical cord, Deputy Martinez appeared at the door. "Ma'am, step away from the electrical panel," he ordered, his hand resting on his radio. "Sheriff Blackwood has instructed me to arrest anyone who attempts to restore power without authorization." "Deputy Martinez, people are going to get seriously hurt," I pleaded. "Mrs. Rodriguez is 93 years old. She cannot handle this heat." He looked uncomfortable, but he did not move. "I am sorry, ma'am. I am just following orders. You need to step away from the electrical panel." I felt trapped. Sheriff Karen had not only created a dangerous situation, she had also made it impossible for me to fix it through normal channels. Her deputies were enforcing her cruel decision, and the local officials were either unavailable or powerless to overrule her. That was when I noticed people starting to gather outside. Word was spreading through the community about what was happening at the cooling center. Maria Santos from the grocery store was there with her daughter. Bob Fletcher from the hardware store was talking to Jake Martinez through the window. "What can we do to help?" Maria called out. I walked outside to talk to them. The heat hit me like a wall, but I pushed through it. Sheriff Karen unplugged all the air conditioning units. She says it is waste of taxpayer money. She has threatened to arrest anyone who tries to restore power. Bob Fletcher shook his head in disgust. "That woman has lost her mind. There are people in there who could die from this heat." "I know," I replied, "but I do not know how to fight her. She has the law on her side, or at least she thinks she does." Maria grabbed my arm. "There has to be something we can do, some way around her authority." I stared back at the building, watching Mrs. Rodriguez through the window. She was still sitting in her chair, but she was wilting in the heat. That was when I made the decision that would change everything. "There is a way," I said quietly, "but it is going to require some creative thinking." That evening, after we had managed to get all the vulnerable residents to temporary safety with friends and family members, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and a cup of coffee. I was going to find a way to beat Sheriff Karen at her own game. I started by researching her actual authority. What exactly could a county sheriff do regarding public utilities? What were the limits of her power? I spent hours reading county codes, state regulations, and municipal guidelines. What I discovered was both encouraging and infuriating. While Sheriff Karen did have some authority to investigate waste and abuse, she had no legal right to unilaterally shut down a city-approved emergency service. The cooling center had been properly authorized by the city council and was funded through a combination of city budget allocations and private donations. More importantly, I learned that her authority was limited to county property and county resources. The community center building itself was owned by the city, not the county, and the electrical service was paid for by the city, not the county budget as she had claimed. Sheriff Karen had lied to me. She had abused her authority and endangered lives based on false information. But proving that would take time, and Mrs. Rodriguez and the others could not wait for a lengthy legal process. I needed a faster solution. I started researching portable cooling options, industrial air conditioning units, temporary climate control systems, emergency cooling equipment rentals. That was when I found Texas Climate Solutions, a company that specialized in temporary climate control for construction sites, emergency situations, and special events. They had trailer-mounted units that could cool spaces up to 10,000 square feet. I called them first thing the next morning. "This is an emergency situation," I explained to the sales representative. "We have an emergency cooling center that has been shut down by a corrupt sheriff. We need temporary climate control for vulnerable residents." "How many people are we talking about?" the representative asked. "Typically 30 to 50 people on the hottest days. Elderly residents, homeless individuals, families with young children. We have a unit that would be perfect. Trailer-mounted system with its own generator, completely self-contained. We could have it delivered tomorrow." "What about permits, inspections, legal requirements?" "As long as you have permission from the property owner and the unit is properly positioned, there are no special permits required. It is just like renting a portable toilet or a dumpster." My heart started racing. How much? "For a situation like this, we can do it for cost. $200 per day, plus delivery and setup." I did not hesitate. "Do it. I will pay for the first week myself." But I did not stop there. I called Maria Santos, Bob Fletcher, and 12 other community members who had shown up to support us. Within 2 hours, I had raised enough money to cover the rental for an entire month. The next step was the most important. I needed to make sure Sheriff Karen could not interfere with the trailer. I spent the rest of the day researching property boundaries, easements, and jurisdiction issues. The community center sat on a large lot with plenty of parking space. The back half of the property was actually owned by the city, but the front section, where we planned to position the trailer, was privately owned by the Methodist church next door. I called Pastor Williams immediately. "Pastor, I need a favor. I need permission to position a climate control trailer on the church property to serve the cooling center. After what that sheriff did to those poor people, you have my complete permission. Do whatever you need to do." I had one more call to make. My nephew David was a lawyer in Dallas who specialized in municipal law. I needed to make sure I was not walking into a legal trap. "Aunt Jenny, what you are planning is completely legal," he assured me. "A privately owned trailer on private property providing climate control to a public building is no different from a food truck serving a park. The county sheriff has no authority to interfere with legal commercial activity on private property." "What if she tries to stop the delivery?" "She cannot. If she attempts to interfere with legal commercial activity on private property, she would be violating federal civil rights laws. You would have grounds for a lawsuit." That night I barely slept. Tomorrow I was going to challenge Sheriff Karen's authority in the most public way possible. I was either going to save the cooling center, or I was going to end up in jail. But Mrs. Rodriguez and the others were depending on me. I had to try. The Texas Climate Solutions truck arrived at exactly 9 o'clock the next morning, pulling a massive white trailer behind it. The trailer was bigger than I had expected, about the size of a small mobile home, with industrial vents and a generator mounted on the side. I was waiting in the parking lot with Maria Santos and Bob Fletcher. We had also invited Pastor Williams to be present as the property owner, just to make sure there were no questions about permission. The truck driver was a friendly man named Carlos who had been briefed on the situation. "Ma'am, I have to tell you, this is the most interesting delivery I have ever made. My boss said to make sure this unit is positioned perfectly and running smoothly. No charge for the extra setup time." As Carlos began backing the trailer into position, I saw Sheriff Karen's patrol car racing down Maple Street. She pulled into the parking lot with her lights flashing, even though there was no emergency. She jumped out of her car and stormed toward us. "What the hell do you think you are doing?" "I am solving the problem you created," I replied calmly. "This is a privately owned climate control trailer positioned on private property with the permission of the property owner. You cannot just bring in unauthorized equipment," she snarled. "This requires permits, inspections, approval from the fire marshal." Pastor Williams stepped forward. "Sheriff, this equipment is on church property. It is a commercial rental unit with all proper certifications. You have no authority here." Karen's face turned red. "I have authority anywhere in this county." "Not on private property regarding legal commercial activity," I said, pulling out my phone. "I have already confirmed this with a municipal attorney. If you interfere with this legal installation, you will be violating our civil rights." She stared at me for a long moment, clearly trying to figure out how to stop what was happening. Meanwhile, Carlos continued working, connecting the trailer to the community center's external intake vents. "This is not over," Karen said through gritted teeth. "I will find violations. I will shut this down." "You are welcome to try," I replied. "But right now, I have elderly residents who need protection from dangerous heat, and you are not going to stop me from providing it." More community members were arriving now. Word had spread that the climate control trailer was being installed. Mrs. Rodriguez was there with her granddaughter. Jake Martinez was standing with several other veterans. 3 young mothers with their children were waiting to see if the cooling center would reopen. Carlos finished the connections and fired up the generator. The trailer's cooling system came to life with a low hum. Within minutes, cold air was flowing through the community center's ventilation system. "System is operational," Carlos announced. "This unit will maintain any temperature you want in that building, regardless of outside conditions. It has its own power supply, so nobody can shut it down by unplugging it." The crowd of community members broke into applause. Mrs. Rodriguez was crying tears of relief. The mothers were hugging their children, knowing they would have a safe place to escape the heat. But Sheriff Karen was not finished. She pulled out her radio and called for backup. "I need additional units at the community center on Maple Street. We have a situation that requires investigation." Within minutes, 3 more patrol cars arrived. Deputies Martinez, Johnson, and Davis got out of their vehicles, looking confused about why they had been called. "I want this trailer impounded," Karen ordered. "It is unauthorized equipment being used to circumvent lawful orders." Deputy Martinez looked uncomfortable. "Sheriff, what exactly are the grounds for impoundment?" "Theft of public utilities, unauthorized commercial activity, violation of safety codes." Pastor Williams stepped forward again. "Sheriff, I am the property owner here. This trailer is legally positioned on my property with my permission. The company has all required certifications and insurance. You have no grounds for any action." I watched Karen's face as she realized she had been outmaneuvered. She had expected to intimidate me into backing down, but instead she was facing a crowd of supportive community members and a completely legal solution to the problem she had created. "This is not over," she repeated, but her voice had lost some of its authority. Actually, it is, I replied. The cooling center is now operational with private equipment on private property. Your authority does not extend here. As Karen and her deputies reluctantly left the scene, I walked into the community center. The temperature inside was already dropping toward a comfortable 72 degrees. Mrs. Rodriguez was settling into her usual chair, smiling for the first time in 2 days. "Mija," she said to me, "you really are an angel." I was not an angel. I was just a retired teacher who had learned that sometimes you have to fight power with power. But the fight was far from over. I should have expected what came next, but I was still shocked by the pettiness and vindictiveness of Sheriff Karen's response. Within 24 hours of the climate control trailer installation, she launched a campaign of harassment and intimidation that revealed her true character to the entire community. It started with the traffic stops. Every time I left my house, within 2 blocks a patrol car would pull me over. Deputy Martinez stopped me on Tuesday morning, claiming I had failed to signal a turn. Deputy Johnson got me Wednesday afternoon for allegedly speeding in a school zone. Deputy Davis pulled me over Thursday evening for a supposed burned-out tail light that was working perfectly. Each stop was the same routine. The deputy would approach my car with exaggerated caution, as if I were a dangerous criminal. They would demand my license and registration, then spend 15 minutes running checks on their computer. They would walk around my car looking for violations. They would ask pointed questions about my activities and associations. "Mrs. Patterson, are you involved in any anti-government activities?" Deputy Johnson asked during one stop. "I volunteer at a cooling center," I replied. "That is hardly anti-government." "Sheriff Blackwood has concerns about your recent behavior. She wants to make sure you are not planning any illegal activities." The message was clear. They were watching me. They were documenting my movements. They were trying to intimidate me into abandoning the cooling center. But the harassment went beyond traffic stops. Sheriff Karen began showing up at the community center twice a day, claiming to conduct wellness checks and safety inspections. She would walk through the building, taking photographs, measuring distances, and looking for any possible violations. "This exit door is blocked," she announced on Friday morning, pointing to a door that had a single folding chair placed nearby. "That chair is not blocking anything," I replied. "People sit there to watch the parking lot." "It is a fire hazard. I am documenting it for the fire marshal." She found fault with everything. The water cooler was positioned too close to an electrical outlet. The donated books were creating a tripping hazard. The children's toys were not properly sanitized. The bathroom lacked proper ventilation. None of these supposed violations were real, but she documented them all with her camera and notepad. She was building a case, looking for any excuse to shut down the cooling center permanently. The most disturbing incident happened on Saturday afternoon. Mrs. Rodriguez was sitting in her usual chair when Sheriff Karen approached her directly. "Ma'am, I need to ask you some questions about your living situation," Karen said, pulling out her notepad. Mrs. Rodriguez looked confused and frightened. "I do not understand. What questions?" "I have received reports that you may be living in unsafe conditions. I need to investigate whether you are competent to live independently." My blood ran cold. She was threatening to have Mrs. Rodriguez declared incompetent and placed in a nursing home, just because the elderly woman came to our cooling center. "Sheriff Blackwood, you need to leave Mrs. Rodriguez alone," I said, stepping between them. "She has done nothing wrong." "I will determine that," Karen replied. Ma'am, I need you to answer my questions. Are you taking your medications properly? Are you eating regular meals? Are you able to maintain your personal hygiene? Mrs. Rodriguez started crying. Please, I just want to sit in the cool air. I am not bothering anyone. That was when I realized that Sheriff Karen had crossed a line from professional abuse into personal cruelty. She was not just targeting me anymore. She was terrorizing the vulnerable people I was trying to protect. But her overreach was also her mistake. The community members who witnessed her harassment of Mrs. Rodriguez were appalled. Maria Santos pulled out her phone and started recording. Bob Fletcher called Pastor Williams, who arrived within minutes to witness the scene. Sheriff, you need to leave this property immediately, Pastor Williams said firmly. You are harassing my guests and disturbing the peace. Karen looked around and realized she was facing a hostile crowd. Her deputies were not there to back her up. She was alone and she had pushed too far. This is not over, she said, but her voice was shaking now. I will find a way to shut this place down. As she walked away, I made a decision that would prove to be the beginning of her downfall. I was going to document everything. Every harassment incident, every fake traffic stop, every threatening conversation. Sheriff Karen had declared war on the most vulnerable people in our community. It was time to fight back with the most powerful weapon I had, the truth. The breaking point came when Maria Santos posted the video of Sheriff Karen harassing Mrs. Rodriguez on the community Facebook page. Within 6 hours, it had been shared over 300 times. The comments were overwhelmingly negative, with residents sharing their own stories of Karen's abuse of power. She gave my son a ticket for jaywalking when he was walking to school, wrote Jennifer Martinez. The crosswalk was broken and kids had been using that route for years. She threatened to arrest me for letting my dog off leash in my own backyard, added Tom Fletcher. Said she could see my yard from the street so it was public space. She told my elderly mother that she was going to investigate her for welfare fraud because she uses food stamps, wrote Lisa Santos. My mother worked for 40 years before she retired. The Facebook post caught the attention of Channel 7 News in the county seat. Reporter Sarah Williams called me on Sunday morning. Mrs. Patterson, I would like to do a story about the situation with your cooling center. We have received multiple calls about Sheriff Blackwood's behavior. I agreed to the interview immediately. It was time to take the story public. The news crew arrived Monday afternoon while the cooling center was busy. Mrs. Rodriguez was in her usual chair, though she was still nervous about speaking to reporters. Jake Martinez was more willing to share his story. I served 3 tours in Afghanistan, he told the camera. I never thought I would be afraid of the police in my own hometown. But Sheriff Blackwood treats veterans like we are criminals just because we do not have permanent housing. The reporter also interviewed Pastor Williams, who explained the legal situation with the climate control trailer. This is private property, and we have every right to provide humanitarian services to our neighbors. The sheriff's interference is both legally questionable and morally wrong. But the most powerful moment came when Mrs. Rodriguez finally agreed to speak on camera. She was sitting in her usual chair, holding her church fan, when she looked directly into the camera. I am 93 years old, she said in her soft voice. I have lived in this town for 70 years. I have never been treated with such cruelty by someone who is supposed to protect me. This sheriff made me cry. She made me afraid. That is not right. The story aired on Tuesday evening. By Wednesday morning, the sheriff's office was flooded with phone calls from angry residents. The county commissioners received dozens of complaints. The state attorney general's office opened an investigation into civil rights violations. Thursday afternoon, I received a call from County Commissioner Robert Hayes. "Mrs. Patterson, I owe you an apology. I had no idea what Sheriff Blackwood was doing. The county commissioners are meeting in emergency session tonight to address this situation." The meeting was packed with angry residents. Sheriff Karen tried to defend her actions, claiming she was protecting taxpayers from waste and abuse. But the video evidence and witness testimonies were overwhelming. "Sheriff Blackwood, you endangered the lives of vulnerable residents," Commissioner Hayes said during the meeting. "You abused your authority to harass law-abiding citizens. You violated the civil rights of elderly and homeless individuals. This behavior is unacceptable." The commissioners voted unanimously to censure Sheriff Karen and to refer the matter to the state attorney general for criminal investigation. They also voted to restore full funding for the cooling center and to implement oversight procedures for future sheriff's department actions. But the most satisfying moment came when District Attorney Michael Rodriguez announced that his office would investigate potential criminal charges against Sheriff Karen for civil rights violations, abuse of office, and endangerment of vulnerable adults. "No one is above the law," he said in his press conference, "not even the sheriff." The tide had turned, the community had spoken, and Sheriff Karen's reign of terror was finally coming to an end. 3 months later, I stood in the same community center where Sheriff Karen had unplugged the air conditioning units, but everything had changed. The room was packed with residents, local officials, and media representatives who had come to witness the announcement of Karen's resignation and the implementation of new community protections. The state attorney general's investigation had uncovered a pattern of abuse that went far beyond the cooling center incident. Karen had been systematically harassing low-income residents, threatening elderly citizens, and using her position to intimidate anyone who questioned her authority. The evidence was overwhelming. Effective immediately, Sheriff Karen Blackwood has submitted her resignation, announced County Commissioner Hayes. Additionally, she has agreed to a plea deal that includes restitution to affected community members and a permanent ban from holding any law enforcement position in the state of Texas. The crowd erupted in applause. Mrs. Rodriguez, sitting in her usual chair, was crying tears of joy. Jake Martinez pumped his fist in the air. The mothers with their children were smiling and hugging each other. But the announcement was not just about Karen's downfall. The county had used the crisis as an opportunity to implement lasting reforms. "We are also announcing the creation of a community oversight board," Commissioner Hayes continued. "This citizen panel will review all complaints against law enforcement and ensure that vulnerable populations are protected from abuse of power." The oversight board was Mrs. Rodriguez's idea. During one of our conversations after Karen's resignation, she had said, "Mija, we need to make sure this never happens again. We need people watching the watchers." The board would include representatives from the senior center, the veterans organization, the homeless shelter, and the immigrant community. They would have the power to investigate complaints, recommend disciplinary action, and monitor law enforcement policies. Even better, the county had committed to permanent funding for the cooling center, along with expanded services for vulnerable residents. The climate control trailer was being replaced with a permanent industrial air conditioning system that no future sheriff could simply unplug. "This community has learned an important lesson," said our new sheriff, Maria Santos, who had won a special election on a platform of community policing and accountability. Law enforcement serves the people, not the other way around. Our job is to protect the most vulnerable, not to intimidate them. Sheriff Santos had been Maria from the grocery store, one of the first community members to support us during the crisis. Her election victory had been overwhelming, with over 70% of the vote. As the formal ceremony concluded, I found myself surrounded by the people who had made this victory possible. Pastor Williams, who had provided the crucial property permission. Bob Fletcher, who had helped raise money for the trailer rental. The dozens of community members who had documented Karen's harassment and testified to investigators. But most importantly, I was surrounded by the vulnerable residents who had never given up hope. Mrs. Rodriguez, still sitting in her usual chair, reached out and took my hand. "Mija, you saved us," she said softly. "You saved all of us." I looked around the room at the faces of people who had trusted me to fight for them. The elderly residents who just wanted a safe place to escape dangerous heat. The homeless veterans who deserved dignity and respect. The young mothers who needed support, not judgment. "We saved each other," I replied. "That is what communities do." The cooling center was more than just a building with air conditioning now. It had become a symbol of what happens when ordinary people refuse to accept injustice. It proved that corrupt authority figures can be held accountable when communities stand together. As the crowd began to disperse, I walked over to the new permanent air conditioning controls. There was a small plaque next to the thermostat that read, "In memory of the day our community learned that justice is not just about punishment, but about protection." Sheriff Karen had thought she could intimidate us into submission. She had underestimated the power of a community that refuses to abandon its most vulnerable members. 3 minutes after she unplugged our air conditioning, I had made a phone call that changed everything. But the real change was not in the climate control trailer or the new sheriff or the oversight board. The real change was in the understanding that we are stronger together than apart, and that ordinary people have extraordinary power when they refuse to accept injustice. Mrs. Rodriguez was right. We really had saved each other.